To discuss all of this, let's welcome in our guest here on the set, Seema Sirohi. She's a senior journalist with the Economic Times. Also with us, Kamran Bokhari. He's a national security and foreign policy specialist with the University of Ottawa. Dr. Roby Barrett is a scholar with the Middle East Institute. He's joining us from Dallas, and also with us here on the set, Zhang is a Washington bureau chief for the Shanghai Wen Hui Daily. I want to welcome all of you. Kamran, let's start with you. Indian authorities saying Pakistan's behind this attack, but there's this piece in the Washington Post indicating this kid grew up in southern Kashmir, was involved in the protest in 2016, shot in the leg. His family says he went off and joined the militancy in March, and that this kind of makes it seem like it's a homegrown attack. Is Modi right? I mean, what do you read into all of this?
So I think the issue is one of language that's being used. So there's obviously a political need or a geopolitical rhetoric that has to be employed, whether it's from the Pakistanis or the Indians. But then there's a reality on the ground. The reality is that, yes, this kid was homegrown. He was radicalized, he was likely trained there, but the phenomenon that of Jaish-e-Mohammed and the other groups, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Hizbul Mujahideen, these are the three prominent groups, and then there are other smaller factions. They're cross-border. So they have sanctuaries inside Pakistan-administered Kashmir. And the Indians are saying that, look, the Indian argument is, yes, he's homegrown, yes, he was here, but if it wasn't for the Pakistani support, this group would not be able to essentially recruit and execute these kind of attacks. What the Pakistanis are saying is that you have an indigenous problem, and so don't blame us. Now, obviously, all of this is deflection. The issue is that for the Indians, this isn't the first time. So Jaish-e-Mohammed struck recently, then in 2016 twice, both on military targets, one in January, the other in September. And after that, we had some form of what the Indians claimed a surgical strike in response and retaliation across the border. The Pakistanis said nothing of the sort happened. It was more firing across the border, which is usual. So we just have to wait and see how the Indians are going to respond to this.
Seema, let's talk a little bit about what Modi had to say. Let's listen to what he had to say, and I want to ask you a question on the backside of this. Let's listen in.
If our neighboring nation, which is isolated by the world, thinks that will destabilize India by hatching such activities and conspiracies, then it should leave that dream for good. You will never be able to accomplish this goal, and it's never going to happen.
So Modi, with some tough language, this is a guy who ran for office in 2014, accusing his predecessor of not being tough enough, indicating that he's going to burnish his reputation as tough. Talk to me about how this plays in terms of the election just being around the corner in May.
See, because we are getting ready for the general elections, it's very important for Modi to be seen to be doing something. Although I'm not sure whether there will be a retaliatory strike, but he needs to, because he had talked tough before, he needs to act on his words. So he's kind of in a corner. But I think the whole country is behind him. All the other political parties have said that, we are behind the Prime Minister. Because the attack was so preposterous, and the claim of responsibility has come from inside Pakistan. So while, I agree with most of what Kamran said, but I disagree with the equivalence being drawn in, that India and Pakistan are kind of similar in what they have to say. They're not. India here clearly is the victim repeatedly of big attacks right from 2001, when the Indian Parliament was attacked by a group sitting in Pakistan. So if the Pakistani state is not responsible for curbing all this, who is?
You said he's in a corner with the tough talk. You already have demonstrations, people asking for action. Does that kind of pin him into even more of a corner in a sense? Kind
of. But, I'm sure they have some contingency plans. And, the country does expect him to take some action. The US has given kind of a green signal. The National Security Advisor, John Bolton, told the Indian National Security Advisor that the US is all for India's right to self-defense. And this is clearly, in some people's opinions, an act of war, because it was the paramilitary that was targeted.
Zhang, let me ask you about China. We have some sound from China as well, because they've sounded off on this attack. Let's listen, and I want to ask you a quick question after that.
The Chinese side has stated more than once that Pakistan and India are two important countries in South Asia. China hopes both sides will properly address the existing issues through dialogue and consultation. We hope related countries in the region can cooperate to deal with terrorism and maintain regional peace and security.
China has a unique relationship with both of these countries. Of course, back in 2017, there was the standoff with 73-day standoff in the Doklam region with India. And of course, they have a great relationship with Pakistan in terms of Belt and Road projects. So how do they kind of handle this, straddling both of these countries? What's the response there?
I think China is both a very good friend of Pakistan and also a very good economic partner of India. And China is standing in the neutral position on this specific issue. And also our foreign ministry strongly condemned this act of violence. And in fact, now India and Pakistan are also a part of this Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And the anti-terrorism issue is one very important part of the organization now. And we want to promote more cooperations between member countries in Shanghai Cooperation Organization on this issue. And I think China's position is very, very clear. We are against any kind of violence and terrorism.
Seema?
I would take issue with China being described as being in a neutral position. China is backing Pakistan. They have a friendship that is described as, higher than the mountains and deeper than the seas. Also, China has repeatedly blocked the leader of Jaish-e-Mohammed from being put on the UN sanctions list. Repeatedly. All other permanent 5 members of the Security Council have supported India's request, except for China. So China is not neutral.
Zhang, this has been a criticism for some time. I'm sure you have a response.
Yeah, I think I want to point out that this organization is already on the list of UN's and this anti-terrorism sanction. The only issue is India wants to put this organization in the list of this one specific resolution that is about Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And China is saying that India has to provide very clear proof that this organization specifically has very close link with Al-Qaeda or Taliban. Before that, we cannot endorse it. I think these two are very different issues. China categorically is already denouncing this organization as a terrorist organization, and also we are supporting any anti-terrorism activities by India on this specific issue, but on that specific UN Security Council resolution, that's another issue.
Roby, I want to get you involved in this conversation. I know you have a couple of degrees in history. Why don't you give us a thumbnail sketch of this history? Because these two countries have been at each other over Kashmir for some time. There's been wars as a result of it. Talk to us about the history, if you can, and as a frame of reference, because there's been ebbs and flows. And what does that past history tell us about the possibilities of where we go in the future?
Well, I think when you look at the situation between India and Pakistan, and, I mean, we could go back to 47, we could go back further and talk about the breakup. The real issue here is that in that breakup that followed the British departure from South Asia, you had contested areas, and Kashmir, of course, was the premier example of a contested area between the two. There were others. And as a result, there is this baggage of victimization on both sides, where a problem where at one time or another you may have been able to find a resolution to it early on. Now you're carrying all this baggage of basically 60 or 70 years of conflict. And I just don't see it ending. We've had several hot wars. Now we've got 2 nuclear-armed countries. They've managed not to have a major military conflict. I mean, it's been insurgency and terrorism has been used by in this conflict that's going on now. But I don't really see it ending. And it's a pretty interesting situation the Chinese find themselves in, because traditionally they've been the ally of Pakistan, and there have been all those tensions between India and China because they're very similar in where they want to go and in their size. They're very different in how the political systems work and what's likely to happen in the future. And yet here the Chinese, of course, have to oppose terrorism simply because they themselves are highly vulnerable to Muslim terrorism in Xinjiang and in their western provinces. So absolutely they would oppose that. And so you're stuck on the horns of this dilemma of trying to figure out how you deal with your ally, and yet you know your ally, if not directly supporting, is tacitly supporting. I just actually don't see how, with so much baggage and so much ill feeling and this idea, I think the Kashmiris would just soon have everyone go home and them have some autonomous status, but I just don't see that. I don't see how that can happen. One, it would be politically disastrous for the current Indian government, but to be seen supporting suppression of the Muslim insurgency or terrorism in Kashmir would also be politically disastrous for Pakistan at a very delicate time when the U.S. is talking about withdrawing from Afghanistan. And suddenly Pakistan is left with the age-old problem of how they handle their own Northwest provinces.
Right. There's a lot to cover there. He talked about baggage. He kind of outlined some of it. But I heard one person not too long ago, an analyst, saying, you know, this first it seemed like this dispute was about territory, then it was about independence. Now it seems like it's jihad. Is it all of those things mixed together, Kamran? I mean, how would you describe it?
I think that right now we have a complete takeover by the jihadist elements of anything that was used to be called freedom or independence or self-determination. I think that the dominant groups, and a lot of it has to do with what the Pakistanis did in the 1990s, from 89 when the insurgency broke out until Kargil in 1999, which was a standoff when Pakistani forces and irregulars took over heights inside India. The Pakistanis literally mobilized militias on the basis of religion, on the basis of Islamist ideology. In many ways, that Pakistani strategy has really undermined any effort for self-determination. It has marginalized anybody who actually wants to do this in sort of a constitutional way, in a mainstream way.
Seema, would you agree? I mean, it's just morphed?
Yeah.
Yes, I would agree. But in terms of, if you want to call the partition of the subcontinent, go back in history, there was a UN resolution which had to be followed. Certain steps had to be taken. I know that Pakistan keeps raising that, but the steps Pakistan had to take, they didn't take. So we never had the plebiscite. And yes, I would agree that it's become morphed into a complete jihadist sort of struggle. The tragedy, in my opinion, is that it is the Pakistani society that is being consumed by it. India will withstand this, and I think it'll be fine. But Pakistan is the country that needs to worry about this.
Roby, I know you wanted to jump in there. What were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say it's not just Pakistan. Now, Pakistan, we know, has really serious problems with radical Islamic fundamentalism. But also, India has resorted in identity politics. That's how Modi got there. And this rise of a, I hesitate to call it radical, but certainly more identity-driven Hindu politics, where this differentiation between groups, and this is feted on both sides. The difference, though, here is that from an economic point of view and a future potential as a potential superpower, or a superpower growing, India has that potential, Pakistan doesn't. So in some ways, in a conflict that got completely out of hand and escalated, and it could. But then I think India probably has more to lose in the conflict, in the sense that it really has arrived on the world scene, and Pakistan is in a situation that's not very different, with the exception of nuclear weapons, than it was in, say, the 1960s or 1970s.
Kamran, you were going to say something?
I was just going to add that I think that there is a symbiotic relationship between the Islamist extremism that, and I agree with Seema, is percolating throughout Pakistani society. This isn't just Jaish-e-Mohammed or this group or that group. This is a societal issue. But I think that sort of the rise of Islamist extremism is almost sort of feeding into the right-wing Hindu nationalist rhetoric of Prime Minister Modi's party. And I agree with our friend in Texas that that's a serious problem that's undermining the fabric of secular India. And likewise, when you see the right-wing Hindu nationalists react to Islamists, then they use that rhetoric as justification to further reinforce. So it's a mutually self-reinforcing, dialectic, if you will.
It's gasoline on the fire. How do you put it out?
I think that there are two things that need to be done. One by Pakistan, which is to rein in all these groups. Now, I understand the Pakistanis can't fix their society. That's a long-term problem. But I think that at least the state is capable enough to say, hey, we're not going to allow these groups to go and do whatever private foreign policy, private wars, that what they're doing, and we need to put a stop to this. India needs to somehow then figure out, okay, so how do we deal with the disenfranchisement of the people who feel deprived in Kashmir? And that's something that India needs to do on its own. And then at one level, both these countries have to come together seriously. And these are the three things that have not happened in decades.
We've had sound from India and China. We ought to give Pakistan its equal treatment as well. The foreign minister had some comments. Let's listen to what the foreign minister had to say.
If India has any proof of Pakistan involvement, they should share it with us. We are willing to cooperate. They have not gained anything from blame games in the past, nor will they do so in the future. We are distressed by the human loss, and we condole with the families of the victims. But the knee-jerk reaction that has come from there, the accusations that have come forth without any investigations, are regrettable.
I think this gets back to what you were saying, Kamran. It's just superheated rhetoric on both sides. How do you dial it down?
See, after the attack, there was a very quick claim of responsibility by Jaish-e-Mohammed in Pakistan. So for the foreign minister, with all due respect, to say that, give us evidence, Pakistan says that after every attack, give us evidence. And in the past, India has actually given them evidence. After the Mumbai attacks of 2008, evidence was given to Pakistan. Pakistan didn't do anything with it. The question is, these groups are inside Pakistan. Isn't it Pakistan's responsibility to do some of its own investigations? I mean, after all, they're speaking from there. So this is just boilerplate stuff. I don't take it seriously.
But I have friends who are journalists in Pakistan. There's attacks inside Pakistan as well. I mean, it's a serious issue. How do they deal with it? How does the government handle this?
I think Pakistan Army has to decide whether they will allow democracy in Pakistan ever. Or, because for them, all these jihadist groups are an instrument of power and influence, and to keep sort of attacking India because they see India as an existential threat, despite the fact that India has various Indian leaders, not Modi, previous prime ministers, and Modi included, they all accept the fact that Pakistan exists. We want to live in peace with them. But this tactic of trying to, deliver justice by 1,000 cuts is what they call it, keep attacking India with these kind of terrorist attacks.
Zhang, obviously this relationship we've talked about at Pakistan and China, there's a lot of projects underway. What does the volatility in the region mean for China and this relationship?
I mean, this kind of attacks in Kashmir.
Yes.
And
also the Baluchistan, we've seen incidents there. I mean, the region itself, there's been some volatility there.
Yeah, I think this CPEC, this China-Pakistan Economic Corridor project itself has been a victim of this violence and terrorism. And China is actually pushing and encouraging Pakistani government to take more actions against these terrorist groups. And I think theoretically we have no dispute, and we have to work together with different governments, India, Pakistan, in this region.
Kamran, we've talked about the ebbs and flows. I think it was between 2003 and 2014. It seemed that there wasn't as much volatility. Have we turned the page? Now we're going in another direction. How do you get it back to that stage?
I mean, I think that one of the puzzles that I am still trying to sort of sort out and figure out, what are the mechanics of how these attacks are produced? So there are multiple questions. Number one, are these command authorized attacks? Is the Pakistani inter-services intelligence actually ordering these attacks and controlling them, centralized command? Or is it that these groups have been given a free rein and they operate on their own, sometimes, letting their benefactors know what they're doing, and other times just doing it on their own? That's a black box, and it's really opaque. We really don't know, and I guess it's hard to know, because in order to do research, you need to actually go into this nexus of intelligence services and the militancy, and then figure out. And it's a dangerous game for any journalist, much less a researcher and academic. So that, to me, if that sort of puzzle can be somehow more solved, then we can sort of say, okay, where the problem is and how can we stop it. Right now, but the Pakistanis see this as being blamed, and then we're not supposed to assume that there's one voice in Pakistan. So there's a civilian government, there is the military, there are other civil society actors, opposition parties. They're not on the same page on this issue. Some are willing to say, well, yes, we do have an extremist problem and we need to solve it. There are others who say, no, it's India's fault and India needs to take care of its own problems instead of pointing fingers. You never get anywhere because of this sort of deadlock.
Go ahead.
It's well understood that the Pakistani army and the ISI, the intelligence service, if they, they've used retired officers. Many brave Pakistani journalists have reported on that, right? And they have paid for with their lives for writing those stories. So I don't think we need to get the exact mechanics or a piece of paper that says that ISI ordered it, but retired army officers have been implicated in the Mumbai attacks. There was intelligence intercept of a telephone conversation. So I think there's plenty of evidence.
Go ahead, Roby.
Well, that's really not how it works, okay? So I think you have to go back and look at the structure of both societies and the baggage they brought to it. Neither one of them can really go forward or step backward. I mean, India can't say, okay, you're right, we'll cede Kashmir or even support an autonomous state. India is a very, very diverse culture politically, and to hold it together in this age of identity politics, it's a very, very tough thing to hold something as diverse as India together. But that said, Pakistan is even in a weaker position, because this idea that there are some people that oppose Muslim fundamentalism in Pakistan and the terrorism that springs from it, absolutely correct. But those people aren't in a position to do anything, and the whole idea of the fundamentalists constitute a significant threat to Pakistani stability and this idea that somehow the state can prevail and do away with these people and eliminate them. I just don't think it's very realistic. Everybody's got too much baggage, can't go forward, can't go backward. There's not a big S solution. The bottom line is, what are you going to do to keep individual incidents like this and others from escalating into something that is really, really seriously damaging, like perhaps even a nuclear exchange.
Well,
it's a case by case.
Well, Roby, we're going to have to leave it there, but you've given us a lot to think about, as have all of you. Thank you so much for joining us, and that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.